going to introduce a group of innovators who bring us dispatches from around the world. Our moderator is John Palfrey, who is the Henry N. S. Professor of Law and the Vice Dean for the Library and Information Services at Harvard University. He's going to be joined by James Rucker, Juliana Rotich, John Medea, and Jake Shapiro to discuss the ways that technology is being used for social good right now. John, come on down. The floor is yours.
Many things to thank you for, as many people do here. On that list is not the job of following the surprise appearance of the President of the United States, nor standing between this group and OK Go, which are practicing out there and going to be completely amazing. So panel, we have our work cut out for us. We're going for 45 minutes, so we're in a slightly speed talking mode here. I want to follow up on the way that Omar started, though, the last session, the last panel. I know President Clinton was fond in the game of golf of letting his partners take a mulligan if they had a bad shot off the beginning. When Omar started, he said good morning and was met with silence. I was a member of the audience, and I know a bunch of people said, let's try it again. So I'm going to say good morning, and everybody's going to say good morning, Omar, and Jillian York is going to blog it. Are you ready? Okay, this is for you, Omar. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. All right, we did better. That's great. So we have a great panel, as all these ones are. I'm going to introduce them very briefly, and then we're going to talk about some inspiring stories, but I also hope to tie it very closely to some of the infrastructure issues that are running underneath the technology, but also underneath the conversation. Immediately to my left is James Rucker. He is the founder of some extraordinary organizations. One is Color of Change, and we'll hear more from him in a moment. Juliana Rotich is involved in two of my favorite organizations as well. One, she was a writer for Global Voices, which we'll hear more about later in the day. But she's also a co-founder of Ushahidi, which is one of the stories we've already heard some about and we'll hear more about. John Maida was at the MIT Media Lab, one of the leading organizations in this space for a dozen years or so, both as a professor and as a director of research. He's now the president of RISD and brings an extremely interesting perspective to this conversation. And a great friend also to this business is Jake Shapiro. He's the founding executive director of the Public Radio Exchange and one of the great social entrepreneurs of this business. So please welcome this panel with me. So James, let's start with you, if that's okay. And if you might start us out to think about this question of organizing, online organizing and offline organizing. You're somebody who has made a name for yourself in a series of organizations, including Move On and Color of Change. And I think you're associated with this idea in a way of online organizing. We've also had in the background an article recently many of you have read by Malcolm Gladwell where he's challenging some of these assumptions about online versus offline organizing. How do you think about this? Are you in the online organizing business, or is this just organizing?
Yeah, I think as with any new thing, new technology, new concept, they get played up and often overplayed, and then also I think often misunderstood. My background is very interesting. I was an everyday person who read the news, or rather watched the news, read the newspaper, wanted to see things happen, but I was a software engineer, and I never found a way to plug in. And so part of what compels me about this whole online organizing world is the way it has helped everyday people who are not kind of self-styled activists. They're not people who see this as a career path or as something that's such a defining characteristic of their person, but rather they're everyday people who care about certain things and they want to make impact. And so I tripped across Move On like many people did, an email from a friend. And the next thing I knew, I was deeply engaged in making political change happen in a way that I had never done before. I had done service work, things like that, but I hadn't jumped into politics. And so that's kind of what caused me to go to Move On. And then, maybe we'll talk a little more about the actual path or what I've done. But I think that we've had organizing happen over the entirety of history. People dissatisfied with conditions, coming together and channeling their energy to make a certain kind of change. What we now have are new technologies. In the same way that in the civil rights movement, the television was a key technology for providing conveying a certain narrative to Americans and asking America, is this America? Without television, as a tool, as a technology, you couldn't have the kind of change happen that we saw happen. And so today we have new technologies. We have things like Facebook. Gladwell critiques Facebook and other technologies, saying these are essentially lightweight. The reality is they're tools that play into strategies. They don't happen in a vacuum. So with the case of Egypt, it wasn't as if there was a Facebook page and suddenly you have a revolution. There was actually a set of folks who had studied movements in other places and struggles in other places, and they used Facebook as a technology in a key moment in time to advance their struggle. And that's kind of the key to online organizing. We strategize campaigns in the same way that you would do a marketing campaign, or in the civil rights era, you had campaigns that started with, say, the lunch counter. There were these moments that were low tech, and then there were other techniques that were deployed to actually carry out the full arc. And that's the same case here.
Wonderful. So one of the arguments I think that we're building here over the course of the day is the importance of the infrastructure of an open internet, with then the idea that on top of that we can build wonderful unexpected things, generative things, in the words of Jonathan Zittrain, who was introduced in the last session. So maybe could you tell the story a little of Color of Change and how it relies upon this open network that we have come to almost take for granted?
Absolutely. And so just, what I think is interesting, and for folks who don't know what Color of Change is in Citizen Engagement Lab, which are the two projects that I spend most of my time working on, it's this basic idea of, let's say, online organizing combined with offline action, where everyday people are brought into being change makers. That capability to reach out with a message that may not be friendly to a set of corporations, it may be challenging government, the open nature of the internet allows us to message to our constituency, as long as it's legal. We can tell the truth, we can do kind of whatever we want. We are unable, for instance, let me give an example. Lou Dobbs was on the air at CNN spouting a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric. My partner, Ina Naba, who's here in the audience as well, we co-founded, along with a few others, a group called Presente, which is a Latino advocacy group, kind of like Color of Change is a black advocacy group. We had a video that we couldn't get any network to touch. It talked about Lou Dobbs being this voice of anti-immigrant hate. At the same time, CNN had a series called Latino in America, which was catering to this brown audience. And there was a problem there. We had a video that did a great job of explaining that problem. We couldn't get that carried through corporate media, but we could put it on the internet.
It's amazing. So you guys are doing the fair fight that the president just talked about in the American discussion space.
Yeah, and a lot of others as well. So the key, though, is that and I don't want to make this a soapbox for net neutrality and other issues, but what I think is very important is
some people might, but anyway.
As the net evolved, I remember early on in the early 90s, and then we were using this in school, in college, and it was this interesting tool, but there wasn't a commercial application of it yet. And then there were the search engines, and it soon became clear you'd have full businesses like Zipcar, which couldn't exist without the internet, come into play. And as businesses recognize the threat to existing businesses and the opportunities by controlling it, and as governments recognize the threats and opportunities that come along with controlling it, there will be, and there is, an attempt to do so. And here, it's largely a corporate-driven issue.
Absolutely. So, Juliana, I want to turn to you and use this as a pivot to understand more the story of Ushahidi. I suspect that most people, when they hear that you're running a nonprofit company that develops free and open software that uses geolocation and all sorts of cool mapping things and so forth, probably don't necessarily have a sense of what that actually means and what the range of opportunities are that you could do and you can do all around the world, leveraging many of the same things that James is doing. Could you tell the story of Ushahidi and the breadth of what's being done with it?
Sure, and I really connected with James's point about you don't start out saying, oh, I'm going to change things in the world. Just the same way he started with an email from a friend. Ushahidi started as an email between friends. One of them is here today, Ethan Zuckerman. He was integral in supporting us in that very early on stage. And what happened is, through the internet, Ushahidi wouldn't be here were it not for the internet, for the open internet, that we were able to connect. So again, this idea of technology plus the human network, then we're able to collaborate and make something happen. And at that time, the issue that we were dealing with was during the post-election violence in Kenya, the media, there was a ban on broadcast media on the 30th of December 2007. So that was one of the most immediate problems, because there was a gulf between what we saw and what was being reported in the media. And luckily, when you have amazing people like David, Eric, and Ori, we tried to find ways around this.
Can we use some last names? I think
Yes.
I know these people, but maybe you
Sure.
should introduce them by name, since this is being recorded for posterity as well.
Absolutely. So Ori Okolo was a lawyer.
Graduate of the Harvard Law School?
Yes,
Uh-huh.
one of
Berkman
your
Center.
students. Yes.
Started blogging in my class. I'm very proud of that.
Yeah. And Eric Hersman was a technologist doing web development in Florida. And David Kobia he still runs one of the most popular forums in the Kenyan blogosphere. So as friends, and then there were other people, there's also Daudi Were, who's also one of the early bloggers in the Kenyan blogosphere. He's one of the first people who, he went online and searched for Kenya, and instead of finding information about Kenyan bloggers, he found information about the Lion King and safaris. So
Nothing like commercialization of the internet.
yeah, so to give you a bit of context, it's the blogosphere and that connectedness of the Kenyan online community is what brought about Ushahidi. And granted, at that time, the access to internet was 2.8% in Kenya. So again, the collaboration was very transnational, and I think that's something to keep in mind, because you not only have offline organizing, but what the internet allows for that is for that to be diverse and also to cross borders, and I think that makes for interesting solutions.
So if I might follow on to that with one more question for you, for starters, Juliana. You've been reading a book by Kevin Kelly, as I understand it, quite an interesting one, and maybe give a sense of what that argument is, but maybe could you do it in the context of one of the uses of Ushahidi that was unexpected? So I think one of the arguments here is we have a platform that is the open internet. People then build free and open source platforms like Ushahidi, and then people do things on top of it, but there are human and other layers that come into play in context, obviously, that's different than just the technology.
Absolutely. One of the most, there are two surprising uses of the technology platform, ways that we did not expect. So it's been used around the world for crisis information management, for example, in Haiti and in Pakistan for the floods. But in Russia, when there were fires, it was used to actually pair people who wanted to assist and others who were suffering. So that was and they call it a help map. That was really interesting. And then most recently, here in the US actually, we have a cloud-based service called CrowdMap that enables you to use the Ushahidi platform quite easily. And there was one called blizzardbabies.crowdmap.com. And these are midwives in the US. There isn't one central repository of information of midwives, but they used CrowdMap to say, if you're stuck and you need assistance, hey, I'm a midwife and I can assist. This is my phone number. This is my address. Now, that really blew us away.
It's amazing. So John Maida, you have lots of things in your background that blow us away as well, through design and so forth. But in the context of education, you're the president of a university. You have lots of ways in which you reach out to your community, but you also tweet consistently. I don't know if anybody follows his Twitter stream, but it's awesome, and he tweets all the time. I have no idea how he's being president of a university while also tweeting as much as he does. Must be part and parcel. Mr. Ubinas, I don't know if you're tweeting quite that much as president of the Ford Foundation, but
I don't have that magic.
he's probably tweeted a few times while he's been on the stage. In fact,
my hands didn't even move.
Could you give us a sense, John Maida, how the internet as this platform is in fact affecting the way you're leading an educational institution and what the possibilities for change are there?
Well, the long story made short is that I realized that social media doesn't really work in certain cases, especially if you're leading a local community It works great for global interventions. It's fantastic for that. As president, I used every possible weapon to galvanize my community of alumni and arts and designs people all over the world. Works great, but for a locale, it does nothing at all. That is why today I handwrite all my memos to campus on paper with a flower sometimes in frame and take a picture with my hand there as kind of a way I think that we have to blend both, do both the virtual and this physical thing. This human thing will always stay together. A network doesn't matter if there aren't people connected. I think you mentioned technology plus the human network. Tim Berners-Lee said this nice thing about the web works best when it is decentralized. In the web, we are disembodied, therefore very easily decentralized. But when you're an organization with people, they are there, and they don't like to be decentralized. It's confusion and chaos.
One of the things we tend to talk about in gatherings of this sort is the extent to which young people have, in many cases, not all cases, there's a very important digital divide and skills divide, but many students going into university have strong skills in this area and can use these technologies in inspiring ways. Are you seeing that on your campus, and how would you contextualize that?
I have some good news to report. So I was really focused on Facebook as part of my engagement strategies at RISD, and it worked great for like alumni again, the global thing, but boy, it didn't work on campus, and I couldn't figure it out. So what I often do is I'll sit to have lunch with students in the cafeteria, just randomly bring my tray, and sometimes they run away, but sometimes they say, okay, go ahead, we'll let you sit. And I sat down with a group, and I said, so you know what, I've been trying to use Facebook to connect with you, and it doesn't work. Can you tell me why? Because I have like 5 daughters, and 3 are in high school age, and they're always on Facebook. One literally like lies down like this with a laptop. and like she's always on Facebook, so why aren't you on Facebook? And they all looked at me like I was crazy. And they said, well, you know, when you're in high school, you have home and you have school. And when you're at home, you don't want to be at home. So you have Facebook where you can be at school while you're at home. And they said, well, we're here like at RISD on our campus. All our friends are here now. If you just stand there, you'll see 5 friends.
Not if you're looking into your mobile device, you won't.
I know, like, whoa.
I'm not sure if that was the good news, the bad news, or what, but we'll come back to that. So Jake Shapiro, you have yet another inspiring story in the space in the founding of the Public Radio Exchange. You also, I think, speak in some ways to the duality of a moment of concern and crisis that we face with respect to this network, because there are some real constraints in terms of what you're doing. Could you tell us the Public Radio Exchange story and why it is one that is somewhat also about peril?
Absolutely. So PRX, Public Radio Exchange, was founded really with the purpose of making public radio more public and to be a bridge between this extraordinary moment of the internet, democratizing the creation of media and the distribution of media, and the powerful potential that public broadcasting in this country and public media worldwide as an institutional societal investment in a public service media sector has to help, I think, map and provide context in this chaotic new space. So PRX is really an open distribution marketplace. You can put up the slide that shows just our homepage, but essentially it's an open network where we invite thousands of producers to upload documentaries and stories. We make them available on the web for local stations around the country to broadcast.
And this is prx.org, right? If somebody's online here, you can see the interactive version on your PCs.
And you can sign up right now, and if you happen to be recording any audio, you can upload it and make it available to stations across the country. But the idea really being that there is this powerful connection between independent producers who are creators and storytellers who are remarkably diverse in a growing group, and local institutions. And it's important to remember that one of the huge assets of public broadcasting that remains one we have to think about reinventing but need to secure is the fact that we have a local presence, that in fact some of its strength is that it's decentralized. It's a real limitation in thinking about how to map it onto the web. But we're trying to be a bridge between that and the kind of global audience online. And if you show the next slide, the result of it is a new kind of network. And I think this happens to be about data from PRX about how distribution has changed from being a one-to-many broadcast to something that's connecting organizations and institutions. But I think that's thematically something, I think if you had a slide for any one of our organizations and how we're trying to now interrelate not just social networking on an individual level, but what intermediaries and media organizations can do when they network their own content together, that's really what PRX has tried to unveil.
And you've done it beautifully, and the map shows the reach that you've had. But Jake, let me push a little bit further in this way. So I think one of the big questions for this gathering is whether or not social media and technology and so forth cuts in one direction. I think we've complicated that picture. It's clear that there are ways in which it cuts in multiple directions. But one might say that it's impossible to think about doing some form of social entrepreneurship, whether it's activism in the streets or creating a network of public radio exchanges, without thinking about the impact of these media, about integrating it good, bad, indifferent into the mix. And it sounds to me that you're describing the way in which the technology maps also to the networking of organizations as one way that maybe we could think about that. Do you agree with the statement that anybody starting out, trying to do something as an activist or a social entrepreneur, has to at least engage social media or online media in some fashion, and that in fact this slide makes that case perfectly, that it is about the network of organizations and people as well as the technology?
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think one of the realizations is that there's largely a latent value in much of the networks that we see around us. And public broadcasting has an enormous amount of sort of built-up trust and relationships with audiences that it hasn't actually turned the corner into taking advantage of that latent value. And that anybody entering into a new social enterprise, how they are starting to think about it starts with a network philosophy, because they're these days often starting with a Facebook entry point. I worry that some of the platforms we talk about, when we talk about a Facebook or YouTube, I think this is a theme brought up today, they're not constructed with that in mind. It's not so much about turning them towards a social purpose, it's making sure that social purpose media pushes into that space and does it at scale, which I think is one of the real challenges. You know, the searching on the web and getting the Lion King result first, we're up against the content farms of the world who are finding commercial ways to really make the internet that path. The only way to get out there is to push in a really significant way using digital tools.
It's that J.C. Penney article you may have
Yes,
seen
that
on the
was
New York
amazing.
Times, an extraordinary story. So I want to get the human network that's in the room into the conversation. I'm going to start by calling on Ian and Abba, if I might. But the audience, we're coming for you next, so get your questions ready. Ian, you've been involved in a project with James that he mentioned, the Citizen Engagement Lab. And to me, this is a particularly inspiring story as a networking story, which is, as I understand it, that in thinking about Color of Change, you guys realized in the context of the immigration battles that the things that were being done in one community were not being done so well in others, and you thought about an incubator. So I wonder if you tell a little about this story and how this sort of maps to the platform story that we're talking about here.
So James and I met in 2006, a year after he had started Color of Change. And I think James had realized while he was at MoveOn that MoveOn, when you create these kind of online organizing initiatives, they typically have a kind of a DNA to them, both in terms of how they organize and carry out their work, but also in terms of the membership that they service. And so once you start servicing for a particular community, it's often hard to branch beyond that community. And so James realized that MoveOn was not going to be able to service the interests of the African American community, for example. And so that's why he started Color of Change. And as we started working together in 2006, we saw the immigrants' rights marches throughout the streets here in the United States. And it was one of the biggest outpourings of activism that we've seen in a long time. And we wondered, was there going to be a network to kind of capture that energy and take it forward, particularly towards immigration reform? And we realized that there was not an equivalent to Color of Change for the African community, African American community, as there was for the Latino community here. And so we decided that we wanted to start an infrastructure organization called Citizen Engagement Lab, which could basically take a lot of the guesswork out for social entrepreneurs. So we could provide a baseline of technology platforms, help them with campaign strategy, help them fundraise, provide back office, so that organizers could do what they really love doing, which is to organize. And so we partnered with a couple social entrepreneurs, Fabiana Rodriguez and Roberto Lovato, who really wanted to organize for their community but didn't have the skill set to do it. And through the lab, we were able to kind of provide them the infrastructure and the support to create something called Presente.org, which has now grown to over 250,000 members, and has had some fairly significant wins. What James mentioned, a campaign to get Lou Dobbs off of CNN.
Right.
So we really look to want to empower the next generation of social entrepreneurs now who have a good idea, maybe for a campaign or to mobilize a certain community around a certain issue space, and make sure that they have the tools and resources that are available to them to succeed.
It's so inspiring. I love this story where James creates after MoveOn, obviously a hugely successful organization, Color of Change, 800,000 members, and then realizes that all of the learning isn't getting translated. Then you create another one with 250,000. This really is the story, to me, of Tim Berners-Lee's World Wide Web instantiated in human networks. It's very, very inspiring. So let me open it up broadly. And yes, sir, over here. We'll get a mic.
My name is Biko Baker. I'm the executive director of League of Young Voters. And 2 or 3 years ago, everybody was talking about the digital divide. Huge problem. Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen young people, especially young people of color, come on through Droid phones and mobile broadband. But for my organization, we're struggling with trying to develop a metric. Online organizing, you know, is cool. It's easy to sort of describe with email addresses. Most of our folks we talked about earlier are on these closed platforms like Facebook. So I don't know if anybody in this room has figured out a way to aggregate Twitter, Facebook, and other social networking platforms, develop a strong metric to gauge impact. And then my second question is, I've met dozens of smart, young social entrepreneurs who are developing programs and platforms and all types of cool ideas for young people who are unemployed and don't have access to capital. Do you have any suggestions for me to tell them how to monetize their work so they're not just doing it for fun?
Great. So I'm going to suggest that one panelist take each of those, if that's okay, so we can also get to others. Would anybody like to volunteer to tackle the first one about metrics around adoption of some of these technologies?
Sure. So the metrics question is definitely something that many different organizations struggle with. And you can look at adoption, you can look at engagement. In terms of a tool that actually brings all of those together, and I'm not just saying this because I'm part of Ushahidi, but this is actual capability within Ushahidi. You can take content that is submitted via SMS, email, web, Twitter, and there's a social commenting plugin that somebody can submit a report or a comment via Facebook. And all of that information is then available within the Ushahidi platform. And in the dashboard, as the administrator of that particular deployment, you can see specific numbers, as in the data that came through via SMS, via whichever channel. And that can perhaps give you an idea of all these things. And perhaps the coolest thing is the geolocation component. So you can see engagement by county or by country if you have a global deployment. So perhaps if I could suggest one of those free and open source tools that could be useful in your particular case.
I think it is one of the great ways in which the web is different in some respects. It allows for these kinds of metrics to measure success in new and effective ways. So I think it's a great question. John?
Second half of the question.
Love it. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, one thing that I'm learning is being in an art school is there's a lot to learn from artists and how they think. They are natural innovators. And artists are used to being poor and getting by with less resources and actually being quite clever at making things happen. So I think the social change space can learn a lot from watching them. And as a tangible example, everyone probably knows the crowdfunding site Kickstarter? Yeah. Kickstarter. So let me tell you a fundraising story about that. So I was talking to a professor at my house, and she came up to me and said, "John, you're president. Give me some money." And I said, "Well, you know, I don't do things like that, but I will give you $10 from my own pocket if you go out and start a Kickstarter site." Now, everyone I tell that to kind of says, you know, question mark. But this young professor went ahead and did this. And she emailed me the next day and said, "John, I now have a Kickstarter site for my project to build a gigantic hammock that holds 100 people in a park." I said, "Great." And she had a 26 days goal to raise, I think it was $8,000. And I said, "Oh, darn, she actually did this." So without my hands, I began to Twitter and talked about this in different places. And within 5 days, she wrote to me and said, And John, I've actually closed half of it. You know, there was a guy in Hong Kong who gave me like $1,000. And I said, well, a guy in Hong Kong, who was that guy? And he said, she said, Donald Choi. I said, Donald Choi? That's a guy I met last week in Hong Kong, one of our alumni, asking him for money, but he didn't give me any money to receive. But I love how he didn't have to give it to me. He could give it to her, so directly. So that, I think, is an example of the future of how we're going to fundraise.
So John, I love this story, and I'm also a little worried about it. You were speaking to a room full of a lot of program officers, and some of us are grantees here. I'm not sure that the Kickstarter thing is such a good idea. So there's a mic back here, and then after that I'm going to call on Gigi Sohn to ask an infrastructure question as well.
I want to ask the panel a question, and indeed the question's in fact to the entire audience, because I'm looking for ideas. I run a non-profit consultancy called Independent Diplomat. I'm a former British diplomat, and we are a group of former diplomats and international lawyers who advise governments and political groups around the world on how to do diplomacy. They tend to be marginalized groups, people who are left out of the negotiations about their futures. We advise the government of South Sudan, the Polisario Front of the Western Sahara, various island states in the climate change process. And we're wondering why it is that the practice of diplomacy has not been broken open by technology. That just over the road here at the UN Security Council, decisions are made of great import, and that place is, if anything, even more closed than when I worked there 10 years ago. The press is kept outside in literally a little kind of sheep pen to keep them under control. And for all the tweeting of the State Department press spokesman, diplomacy remains a very, very closed practice. What are your ideas? And indeed, if the audience has any ideas, please do approach me over lunch or whatever, how to break open that closed box.
I'd love to take moderator's prerogative. Is Alec Ross still here? Not to embarrass him if he had, I know he had to go. Too bad. Awesome. Is there anybody else from Alex's team here, or Ilana or others who might take this? No? Okay, so I'll turn it to the panel.
Wow. I started thinking about WikiLeaks.
Yep.
And just it's very interesting. I mean, I think, and this is not an answer to the question perhaps, so I'll be really brief, but we're in a culture where, kind of like it or not, information will flow at an increased rate in ways that we hadn't projected before. And so one thing, I'm of this generation, someone informed me because I'm 41, that's why I don't give status updates on Facebook and say what I'm doing and reveal my everyday life. But there are other people for whom that's a natural part of living. And so I think, there's this interesting conversation about WikiLeaks. You will have leaks and you'll have information that goes very far outside of the bounds that folks have expected. I also think, and this is part of why I do the work that I do, is that it's up to everyday people who pay the salaries of people in government, whatever that your government may be, to demand and hold folks accountable when they're not providing the level of transparency that you believe is necessary for government to function well. And that, again, the ability to organize and push back and make democracy work is why I'm motivated to do the work.
I think it's a great answer, and it sounds like a good lunchtime conversation for some people to coalesce around. It seems like one of the big challenges associated with these technologies is that they do push on large institutions like diplomacy in ways that are sort of unexpected. And I know that the story of Alec Ross and Secretary Clinton and others trying to think through how does this change the way the State Department does its business. And I would recommend the speech of Secretary Clinton last night trying to reconcile the response to WikiLeaks along with all of what's going on in this diplomacy session. I think it was actually a beautiful job of that. Gigi Sohn, are you out there? Awesome. I want to hand you the mic, but I would love if you could give us a sense from Washington, some of the contingencies that are in play here. I know we've sort of danced around this question of network neutrality. We've talked a lot about the infrastructure. What are the key issues from your perspective that are sort of the things we're taking for granted that underlie all of this great experimentation and generativity we're hearing about in the sort of social and network layer?
Wow, well, I wasn't expecting to speak, but, I'll do it anyway. My name is Gigi Sohn. I'm the president of Public Knowledge, and there is a lot going on in Washington. In fact, there are 3 hearings going on right now, and I actually testified yesterday on network neutrality, so that is obviously a very, very big topic. As my colleague Art Brodsky mentioned before, the Federal Communications Commission set down basic rules of the road to ensure the openness that Tim Berners-Lee talked about. But needless to say, a certain party in Congress, we're not partisan here, is trying to repeal those rules. And even if they do not succeed, organizations like mine and other organizations in this room are going to have to put sort of the meat on the bones of the rules, because they are very, very bare bones. That's number one. The second one, Tim Berners-Lee also referred to, which is one, unfortunately, when people get into discussions of copyright and intellectual property, everybody runs away screaming. And you might have seen Scott Turow's piece yesterday in the New York Times, which talks about there would be no Shakespeare if he lived today because of the internet. Of course, you forgot that there was no copyright when Shakespeare was alive and practicing his craft. And in fact, he made money from performance, which is what copyright reformers say is one way to go. But I digress a little bit. Because Sir Tim talked about something called COICA, and I'm sure nobody understood what he said except for maybe me when he said that. Basically, that is a push, not only in Congress, but also, unfortunately, by our administration, and again, in contradiction with some of the things that Hillary Clinton said, to allow the government to seize domain names, okay, and force internet service providers not to resolve your search based on the allegations that a particular domain is engaging in copyright infringement. And that really, you know, I'm not pro-piracy, but whatever you think about, you know, copyright infringement, the government, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice should not be able to just simply seize domain names based on allegations of huge media corporations. So to me, those are really the two biggest things that are going on right now. I would say the third thing, and this is really important with regard to the first panel, and Ben Jealous talking about access, is that the Federal Communications Commission is looking to reform the ways that, that people get telecommunications service in this country, something called universal service. And the FCC chairman, and one of the few things that I like that he's doing, is he's trying to switch that huge fund, it's an $8 billion fund, to broadband. So it wouldn't just go to plain old telephone service, your landline telephone, which everybody's getting rid of anyway. And also more would go to wireless as well. So that's number one. And he's looking not only to extend universal service more in rural areas, they're very underserved for broadband, but also in underserved urban areas. So those are just sort of the three very, very big things: ensuring an open internet, both with net neutrality and trying to defeat this other initiative to have the Department of Justice and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement people going in and seizing domain names, and also ensuring that there's universal access to broadband.
John, thank you so much. I'll turn it to Jake, but just to commend Gigi Sohn and Public Knowledge, they're one of the nodes in the network, one of the very big nodes that many of us in the hinterlands refer back to understand what's going on in Washington and the many contingencies, I think, that all of what we're doing relies on in many ways.
I just wanted to make sure, since we're sort of doing a list of things that are under threat, that we acknowledge that there's a moment right now also happening in Congress threatening the entire funding of public broadcasting. And for a lot of the work that we've done, and the Ford Foundation has helped in rethinking and reimagining what public media could be, the collective investment that we make as a society in that system is at stake. It's literally, I think, today being debated in terms of the current continuing resolution, and there's a site, 170millionamericans.org, that's helping track that. 150,000 people have signed up in the last 6 weeks to help push on this. But I feel like even as we're wanting to push public media, we need to protect what's there, and this is a moment where that's actually happening.
Very helpful. Another question from the audience? In the front row, we got a hand.
Hi, Ann Beeson from the Open Society Foundations. I wanted to get back to the funding conversation, because you've got a room full of funders, as you recognize. One of the, of course, huge opportunities that technology has given us is a new opportunity for people to organize around issues and campaigns in a way that doesn't have to go through formal organizations, does not have to be permanent, right? And yet you still have philanthropy stuck in its old world of, you know, funneling money largely through organizational structures. So my question for all of you is a couple of ideas for how philanthropy can actually catch up and be able to fund much more emerging, impermanent projects, social justice projects, so to speak, without having to go through the traditional routes. So.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to use this as a chance to ask the final question of to the group. So incorporate by reference what Anne just said, and it's much better to have a funder say that than me. But I want to frame it in the context of the last panel was about, will the arc of technology bend toward justice? I want to ask the question slightly differently and acknowledge the fact that we have agency in this process. This is a built network. We have the person who designed it right up here. We have the people who are building the layers on top of it. So I want to ask in a different way, which is, how can we together ensure that the arc of technology bends towards justice, acknowledging that it's complicated and that tyrants and others are going to use it in bad ways too, right? So maybe if we go down the line, actually maybe we'll go starting with Jake and come back to James. If you could answer Anne's question, maybe in the context of what philanthropy can do to help us ensure this, but also what we all collectively as a community who cares about this, what we might do to ensure that the arc of technology bends towards justice.
I thought it came up interestingly, and I think that I was glad it came up, that the notion that there's some new talent out there, and the talent isn't in our field just around producing great content or organizing around it. The architects and coders and software developers who are helping create things like Ushahidi will end up helping shape those spaces in a way. We don't want to let them only just assume that public square and the bricks have been set. If we're helping bend that technology, I think we need to be in the game on the public purpose side at a way that is far outstripping what we currently are investing in the philanthropic side. I think there's a big talent gap. We feel it even at our organization. We're competing for developers right now to try to get the good ones who actually see a purpose for what they're doing and are ready to actually build the applications that make a difference. And I'd like to see that. That's not necessarily a permanent single state solution, but a general call for bringing that talent into the field.
And I look forward to your former developers working in the Citizen Engagement Lab
Absolutely.
And so forth. You can see a ripple effect,
There's a
I
whole
think,
training.
from all this, and vice versa, right, plainly. John Maida.
I'd like everyone to calm down a little bit, because the social media thing, it's not really a big deal. It's a big opportunity. But I think that the people factor is powerful. All of your agencies have mastered the art of talking to people, real human beings, in caring, powerful ways. I would say the technology is useful in ways that we have not tapped. In particular, the ability to understand what you're funding, using the ability to visualize this information. I would imagine that every system you're using to look at it not only looks like crap, it probably communicates like crap too. So that's an excellent opportunity for innovation to enter the fray. That's not coming from technology, coming from art and design. Because technology is just a commodity now. A friend told me that nowadays, everybody wants an app, right? I have to make an app. I make an app. And before, like last year, an app was really expensive to make. But now it's really cheap now. And someone said software engineers are the new writers. So there's a lot out there. So it's all possible.
That's highly
now.
bloggable, Joe York, right there. Yeah. It even fits in a tweet, actually. Juliana.
Perhaps if I could look at it again, borrowing the idea of the arc of technology, perhaps even thinking about the arc of generativity. And that brings us to the idea of funding platforms, because the infrastructure of which the open internet is built upon allows the generativity by people building things upon, that then get used in different ways. And those do need some support, because you need to have open systems, open platforms that encourage innovation. So then that's the technology component, and I'll just add to the importance of the human network, the community bit, that also needs to be funded. That way you're coupling technology with the community, and that's how you can turn the needle, actually, if you pair those two things. And in funding the different projects or programs that include technology, to also fund the community bit, which is a bit longer term and actually a much bigger challenge.
I agree with almost everything that's been said, if not all of it. I also think what's been interesting coming out of the software world, where there's a certain pace to assessing of deals and investment with the expectation there will be failure. You're more interested in finding things that are going to be truly game-changing, and you suffer some losses of things that had some promise but didn't happen along the way. And so I think trying to identify, taking certain risks, placing more bets, in some cases smaller bets, on whether it's proven leaders, a very interesting model, but being willing to innovate. Because I think that's what's happened over the course of the internet is you've had this just drastic kind of hyper-level innovation where new platforms come into play, change an industry, change the government of a country. I mean, you have this kind of enablement, and I think for organizing in particular, I think we have I feel like we've just scratched the surface. I mean, as proud as I am of the things that I've done and the things that others have done, I feel like we're just scratching the surface. And so the reality is if funders are able to identify those people, those projects, some of which may be a 3-month experiment, and not you don't want people to go through a grant process that takes 8 months to get out the other side when, oh, maybe the opportunity is now gone, right? So that being able to place some of those in investments, I think, is probably the biggest factor. And the other thing is, there is, and I think people have struggled to get it right, there are existing groups, individuals on the ground in different places, and everyone's first thought is, oh, we'll put a Facebook page up and now we're going to achieve something. Not exactly, or no, actually, for the most part. But there are ways to kind of combine. This is where this online-offline thing to me is very interesting. One of the things we did very recently, in New Orleans, they were going to build a jail. After the storm, they lost their jail. They were going to build it 3 times the size it was before, even though the population of the city is in half. And you fill jails when you build them. That's the problem. But there were folks who were on the ground there who had limited communication ability with their own constituents, though the people who are their natural constituents. Color of Change members in New Orleans helped essentially message on behalf of those groups. We helped them get in touch with those groups. So it's kind of a hybridization where you make use of the human capital that's on the ground with the online.
So if I might take one moment just to try to synthesize some of the comments from this morning into 3 points. What I'm hearing is, one, don't take the infrastructure itself for granted. And I love Jake's notion of the bricks in the public square have not yet been set. We're in fact still building them, and that's one key point. A second one is, don't forget the human layer and the organizational layer that's on top of that, and the skills, and as our friend from the League of Young Voters mentioned, don't forget the digital divide, which is also a skills divide that's very, very important. And then third, even though it's not unidirectional, that the arc is necessarily going in one direction, that there's huge opportunity here, and that the opportunity spans across different fields. It's not just in technology itself, but it's in these other social justice sectors where I think technology and what we're talking about here can be a cross-cutting thing that is a horizontal where these are verticals. And I think that the reason that we're all here and so excited about this is the unexpected, the fact that you can't tell the next brilliant thing that's going to happen on Ushahidi, and that is what's so excited, the generative platform that will produce something we don't quite know what it is, sometimes crazy, sometimes great, sometimes WikiLeaks, sometimes Egypt, but it's going to be amazing. And thank you to the Ford Foundation and others for convening us to talk about it. Thank you so much.